It is generally believed that life on Earth originated by itself. Various chemical elements on our desolate and lonely Earth, under the influence of temperature, radiation, pressure, were put into the most bizarre configurations until the DNA model appeared, but only then life. To check if this is really the case, American professor Steve Benner decided to create a model of life artificially. It took him 20 years to grow real DNA. However, when it succeeded, the scientist was cruelly disappointed. The model of the born life turned out to be dead. Why? As the distressed scientist himself says, if you take molecules and breathe energy into them, you will get a mixture like hot asphalt, which is more suitable for paving than for the beginning of Darwinian evolution. In other words, life cannot arise by itself. Then a world-renowned biochemist, who does not suspect the imagination, and has set the scientific world the question is, who puts that first match, which ignites the flame of life? Some believe that there are still unknown laws of the universe. Others, on the contrary, believe that life gives a kind of higher intelligence. Still others argue that there is no contradiction in this, it's just that life on our planet is not unique, and it spreads in outer space of a similar infection. Here is what the famous Swiss researcher Erich von Däniken thinks about this. We can assume that evolution on another planet takes a different path. There are no more people like us. But this is a mistake. There is a famous theory of the Swedish Nobel laureate, Svante Arrhenius, with which I also agree. This is the so-called theory of panspermia. According to it, intelligent beings once appeared in the universe, which began to spread their own kind. In other words, we are a copy of some alien life form. Indeed, the history of evolution on Earth is full of the mystery of the paradox. One of the most inexplicable archaeological finds is being investigated today at the Natural History Museum in Vienna. A stone disc with a diameter of 22 centimeters, found in the jungles of Colombia. The artifact is at least 6,000 years old. It was called the genetic disc, and it's all a complete mystery to science. On the surface of the disc, made of the hardest lyddite stone, amazing images are carved in an unknown way. There is no doubt, these are the stages of development of the human body, starting from the moment of conception. The other side of the disc shows scenes of cell division. How 6,000 years ago, people could see it all without a microscope. Here you see this egg fertilized and unfertilized. There are spermatozoa here. On the reverse side, there are densely different stages of development. Here you see a man, a woman, a child. The Austrian archaeologist Klaus Dohna specializes in such finds. He conducted a preliminary analysis of the disc. Everything speaks of the highest technology of its manufacture. Lyddite crumbles from the slightest mistake. But this item is perfect. Moreover, the outline of the drawing speaks not of manual work, but of factory stamping. An expert who understands how stones are processed said that it is impossible to make such a disc even today, without the use of special technologies. Who showed the ancient artist paintings that modern equipment captured less than 20 years ago. Where and how was this disc made? And what could it be intended for? Perhaps another incredible archaeological discovery can push us to the solution. Items that were found nearby. Along with the disc was found tools, which we did not understand. We only suspect that they were used in medicine. But at what level was the medicine of that civilization? The study of strange objects allowed the famous German archaeologist Hartwig Hausdorff to put forward a bold version. It seems to me that many years ago, highly developed beings lived on Earth, for whom genetic technology was not a secret behind 7 seals. They possessed methods that still seem to us to be science fiction. But the most unique specimen from the collection of Klaus Dohna, fragments of bones of a huge man. This is an absolutely authentic artifact. Its dimensions and dating are indisputable. We found a destroyed human skeleton in Ecuador. A man 7 meters 60 centimeters tall. This is a human calcaneus. And the second part that can be identified is the occipital bone, the lower part of the skull. It looks exactly the same as us humans. It differs only in size. It is 5 times larger. If we take into account that people at that time had a height of 150 centimeters, then 5 times more. That's exactly 7.6 meters. These remains were found in Ecuador in 1904 year. Don was able to take some of them with him. When he showed them to experts and doctors, they were very surprised, but confirmed that the bones can only belong to a person. The age of the find is more than 10,000 years. In Bolivia, Klaus Dona has made another strange discovery. Burial of people with a height of about 2 meters 60 or 80 centimeters. But the most amazing thing, they have an unusual elongated skull. The most interesting thing, in the top of the skull, they, unlike us, Homo sapiens, have a connection line of 3 bones. They looked, as they are beautifully expressed today, like eggheads. This is a completely unusual way of connecting the bones at the top of the skull. In other words, they are by no means Neanderthals or Cro-Magnons, and not Homo sapiens. It would be very interesting to determine the age of these skeletons and do a DNA analysis to determine what kind of people they are. I must say that elongated skulls are found all over the world. In Asia, Africa, and South America, it is believed that they belonged to ordinary people, who artificially changed the shape of their heads with the help of bandaged boards. In ancient times, it was fashionable to wear such a head. The long egg-shaped head of some ancient peoples was a sign of royal origin. Why? That's another question. However, according to Klaus Don, there are skulls that do not fit into this explanation either. The most interesting find related to long skulls we made during our trip to South America, in Peru. Skulls, the shape of which, and this was confirmed to me by experts, cannot be explained only by artificial elongation. They are twice as long as ordinary human skulls. And this absolutely excludes artificial elongation. And these people themselves were much bigger. How did creatures with such skulls arise? If they were ordinary people, why did their heads stretch out so much? This can really be done with the help of high medical technologies. But why? Why did the sons of the gods marry earthly women? But, I'm sorry, angels don't make love. Who taught the ancient Hindus neurosurgery? It also describes plastic surgery, and all the information is very detailed. Perhaps the ancients believed that people with a big head are smarter. But modern scientists have found out that intelligence depends not on the volume of the brain, but on the number of convolutions. Experts are inclined to a different theory. Elongated skulls, the product of genetic engineering, or the consequences of crossing a person with another creature. This idea did not arise out of nowhere. Philip Coppens, the author of a number of sensational historical investigations, found a sacred text in ancient Aramaic, which describes an incredible case. This is an example of Natalina, who is not even mentioned in the Bible. She descended from heaven, took the form of a woman, and her offspring from God was a child with an unusually large head. A child who tried to be born would tear up everything of his mother, and this would lead to the death of the mother and child. At some point in time, it became clear that the baby's head was so big that he could not pass through the birth canal, and some special help was needed to save both the mother and the child. So who were the giants with elongated skulls? Mutants or another race? Where did they come from, and where did they live? What are they even known for? Perhaps the answers to these questions are in ancient texts. American archaeologist David Childress found them in the Bible. The book of Genesis says that the sons of God descended to people on earth. They were people of huge stature and similar representatives of other worlds. It is often noted that they had a large oblong head. The Bible says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, and they found them attractive. And these are the Nephilim, or Anunnaki, took them wives of all. In general, the whole Old Testament history is permeated with some kind of sophisticated eroticism and sexuality. In almost every ancient source, there is a story about how certain beings who look like people, but not people, entered into relationships with earthly women. Some were seduced, and they surrendered voluntarily. Others were persuaded to cohabit by force. Moreover, both girls and married women became the object of harassment, which naturally gave rise to conflicts. Then these women got pregnant, and they had babies, also a little strange, like their dads, but very smart. The dads looked very much like business travelers. They appeared from somewhere in the sky, had affairs, then dumped back. Sources call them the sons of God, but there is a feeling that they did not behave very godly on earth. I spent 6 years at a Catholic and Jesuit college. We translated the Bible from Latin into Greek, from Greek into German. And then I asked the professors, what are they talking about? Sons of God, because there are no sons of God. And they enter into intimate relationships with people. And the professors explained to me that they meant angels, fallen angels. But I'm sorry, angels don't make love. But if they're not angels, then who are they? How can one understand the nature of these creatures? The sacred texts say that they came from heaven. In the original text, Elohim is also written, the word God in the plural. By the way, this is one of the main contradictions contained in the biblical texts. The Bible says that God created man in his own image and likeness, and the sons of the gods married the most beautiful of the daughters of men. Here lies the stunning contradiction of the monotheistic religion of Christianity. There is a single God in it to be worshipped, and here we are talking about the sons of the gods. What's the point here? Historians believe that the Jewish sacred texts are not original. They largely repeat the myths of an older civilization of the same region, Sumerian. Already 8,000 years ago, in the valley between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, there were cities of people who knew higher mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, and crafts. All this, as the Sumerians wrote, was given to them by the Anunnaki gods. Amazingly accurate technical descriptions of the gods' actions have been preserved. What are the Sumerians talking about? They say that their gods are Anunnaki, and it is the sky, high is the earth. The Anunnaki are, therefore, their representatives on earth. These Anunnaki allegedly landed troops on Earth 444,000 years ago, organized a colony of 50 of these Anunnaki here. And Enki, the eldest son of Anu, the chief ruler, was appointed their chief. The god Enki, as Sumerian myths describe, created man. Initially, the Anunnaki mined gold and minerals in mines on Earth, but then rebelled. It was too hard. Then it was decided to create a being specially to work. The fact is that life on Earth, and those animals that exist here, genetically or rather, there is no such word, basically have the same basis as we do on our planet, life. And with help, well, I will say in the current words, genetic engineering, it is possible to create from these creatures some kind of such, capable of performing all these auxiliary works necessary for the Anunnaki. And thus free. Then the god Henki, together with the goddess Ninhursag, molded a man out of clay in their image and likeness. This is an academic literary interpretation of cuneiform texts. Zachariah Sitchin, an American Orientalist, has retranslated the Sumerian myth of the creation of man from the original. According to his interpretation, the gods Enki and Ninhursag took the egg of a female monkey and fertilized it with the life force of Anunnaki. Then they implanted it into the womb of one of the Anunnaki women. We all know that the biblical story has some contradictions, but most likely God first created Adam, and then, perhaps, Eve from his rib. But the word rib has many meanings, has a different spelling, and, according to one of the transcripts, it means life force. And the life force is the same cell. We can say that we are talking about artificial insemination. The structure of the DNA cell was changed. The cell was forced to grow. The product was placed in the womb of a woman, and children were born. The first test tube baby, according to the Sumerian sources, it turned out, like every other hybrid, barren. But the Anunnaki, according to legend, needed a lot of workers. Then, through long experiments, the human model was refined. In Sumerian, the name of the first person, Adam. As it is said, they breathed into him a particle of God, but did not give immortality. In the same way, they made him a girlfriend, and people began to multiply. Orangutan, chimpanzee, gorilla. They exist to this day. But we are the only beings who deviated from our kind, because we received new DNA, which opened the way for us to develop intelligence. The desire for knowledge. In the story of Adam and Eve, one can also see something like cloning. It's hard to imagine that 6,000 or 8,000 years ago, it was possible to come up with such a thing. And why? By the way, the Sumerians are not the only ones who undertook to describe the processes that we today call cloning and artificial insemination. In the 2008 year, Professor Lampeter discovered a little-known manuscript about the secret of the birth of the Indian god Mahavira, who is still worshipped by a good half of the Hindus. So it literally says the following: the heavenly gods, watching over earthly affairs from somewhere above, took a ready-made embryo, kidnapped a pregnant woman from the bromide caste, and a god named Devanato performed an operation on her embryo transplant. Moreover, the manuscript gives striking details of this operation. In this text it is written, he plunged her into a deep sleep, but her eyes were open. He did it without hurting her, she was in a dream. With the words, "But allow me, noble lady," he took out the embryo from the womb of Devanagi, and in its place put an embryo god Mahavir. However, after the planting was carried out, it turned out that the gods had the wrong address. It turns out that they did not know that the future god, in order to get an electorate, had to be of the royal family. And the unfortunate woman who was planted with a divine embryo belonged only to the caste of priests. Our gods had to go to earth once again to look for a pregnant queen and correct the mistake. As a result, in the 599th year before the birth of Christ, Queen Treshala gave birth to a healthy child. He was called Mahavira. It was he who later created the religion of Jainism. And this is a historical fact. This is how it is customary to portray Mahavira himself. And this, you must admit, is very strange. These creatures are not very similar to humans. Why does the God King have such massive shoulders and giant arms, female breasts Italy? What's wrong with his eyelids, ears, and nose? Mahavir has some of the so-called attributes of a Buddha. Prince Siddhartha Gautama Buddha himself was also very different from a human being. Perhaps the secret of this appearance is hidden in the strange conception of these royal persons. Professor Lampeter was fascinated by the ancient legend of the migration of embryos, but something made him think seriously. Centaurs and mermaids are the fruits of experiments. In ancient times, the gods created mixed beings. They made dogs with fish tails, fish with dog faces, who built an antenna in the Urals 300,000 years ago. The first thought that arose from the experts, so it's, apparently, the elements of the antenna device. How and why could the ancient Hindus have composed all this? Is it important to clarify that the embryos were changed at one stage of pregnancy? Did they know in ancient times about states similar to hypnosis or anesthesia? These questions are not random. The fact is that in these texts there are also such details of fetal development that modern science has become aware of not so long ago. There are mentions in Indian sacred texts that a woman has from 400,000 to 1,000,000 initial cells, from which the fetus then appears. Now medicine has come to a similar result, from 400,000 to 2,000,000 initial cells, that form follicles in a woman's ovaries, from which an egg is then born, and life is formed. That is an amazing coincidence. It means that the ancients had not just information, but also the ability to carry out these operations. So whether it's all a legend or an incredible fact, there is one very serious circumstance here. Mahavira founded Jainism, a very peculiar religion. Faith forbids Jains to lie, steal, deceive an employer or a client. According to analysts, the trust in Jain businessmen is boundless. In this regard, the ancient texts of the image of Mahavira must also be absolutely truthful. But could someone in ancient times carry out an embryo transplant and know about genetic engineering? Dr. Matt Haven Chedran, a doctor of traditional Indian medicine. According to him, surgery, only one of the directions of extensive knowledge about human health, which is called Ayurveda. In India, no one doubts that even before our era, healers were able to perform the most complex operations. This was taught to them by those very gods from the legends. The first book that laid out the legal principles was Charaka Samhita. It was written by a holy sage named Charaka. In it, he writes about how to treat various diseases. The second book is the Sashruta Samhita. It mainly describes how to perform surgical operations on different organs. It also describes plastic surgery, and all the information is very detailed. A number of scientists believe that this is too broad an interpretation of ancient sources. But if we assume that in ancient times someone owned high biotechnologies, we can find a strange confirmation of this in the nature of the earth. Rare species of animals, impossible from the point of view of evolution. Crested deer are a harmless mammal with the fangs of a ferocious predator. A maned wolf, whose long legs seem to have come from an antelope. The star-bearer. For some reason, 11 pairs of appendages, similar to fingers, grow around his mouth. And the ugliest creature on the planet is a naked digger. This monster is unique. He doesn't age at all. All 28 years of his life, he remains young, healthy, and capable of reproduction. Moreover, is this the only creature immune to cancer? Isn't this an experimental mouse that escaped from an ancient laboratory? Here is what the Filipinos, an American historian, the author of a number of sensational historical investigations, said about this. Nay magazine recently published interim results of a naked digger DNA study. In general, these creatures live contrary to all the rules of the mammalian world. They are home to numerous colonies under the command of the queen, insects, cold and insensitive to pain. It was possible to reveal the mechanism of their eternal youth. As is known, in the cell division of all organisms, each new copy of DNA is slightly inferior to the original. This is called terminal underreplication. That is why we age. But the cells of the digger organism divide with a complete copy of the original DNA. If we could do the same, we would live forever. The deciphered genocode of one of the most mysterious animals, the platypus, presented geneticists with a new intriguing task. It turned out that the platypus has the genes of mammals, birds, and reptiles at the same time. But the biggest oddity is not even in this. A person has two chromosomes responsible for sex. X is a Y, and for some reason, a platypus has as many as 5 pairs. Theoretically, this creature can have 25 different sexes, but this does not happen. Platypuses belong to mammals. Covered with fur, the cubs are fed milk, but at the same time, they lay eggs like reptiles. How this creature could have been created by nature, and in a single copy. We learned at school that everything is a product of evolution. And I am also a product of evolution. But evolution makes incredible leaps. And there's no way to explain it. Big discussions are unfolding around the whale. We say that a whale is a fish, but we know that a whale is a mammal. Little whales suck milk. And then they say that the whale used to live on land. It is difficult to imagine a reason why a land animal would suddenly decide to live in water and instantly acquired special organs that allow diving underwater and giving birth to children there. I believe that such creatures are the consequences of genetic manipulation. Erich von Däniken, a Swiss researcher of ancient texts, is one of the most famous proponents of the hypothesis that representatives of alien civilizations visited the Earth in the distant past. It was their ancient people who took them for gods. Of course, this hypothesis is rather speculative, but the conclusions of the Swiss researcher are interesting because working with primary sources, rare and ancient manuscripts, he gives us information that, at least, should be voiced. In ancient literature, an Egyptian priest is known, whose name was Manifesto. Most of the manuscripts of the Manifesto have been destroyed. Cardinal Aesbius often quotes Manifesto in his works. And you can read in Aesbius, in ancient times, the gods created mixed beings. Aesbius lists for a whole page all kinds of these creatures with a horse's body, and the upper part was human. In Greek mythology, this was the centaur. They created bulls with human heads. In Greek mythology, this was the minotaur. They made dogs with fish tails, fish with dog faces, completely different creatures. However, there is a more obvious fact and thought-provoking. Genetic engineering of modern civilization began with experiments on plants. It's a strange coincidence, but it was in this area that scientists discovered the first traces of artificial interference with the genocode. For example, ordinary wheat. In science, it is accepted that modern cultivars formed by conventional breeding of wild species. But this explanation does not quite suit those who know how it happens. This question is very interesting to geneticist, candidate of biological sciences, Mikhail Borodachev. Where did, for example, the third turgidum come from? This is a hexaploid wheat, and it has been around for many thousands of years. About 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, it appeared. It is a complex hybrid, an amphiploid hybrid according to genetic positions. By itself, he would hardly be able to gather in nature. Someone has collected from 3 different species one new, hexaploid, very productive. But that was thousands of years ago. Geologists emphasize that it was absolutely impossible to create complex interspecific hybrids from wild cereals using conventional breeding. Random mutation is also excluded. Of course, they could have been created by themselves in nature, just as a tractor could be assembled from scrap metal by itself. But here we don't know how it happened. Apparently, the previous civilization that existed before man. There are legends about Atlantans, about Lemurians. So they could have knowledge of genetic engineering and create these species that have not been found in the nature of their predecessors. The oldest cultivated plant on Earth is corn. Mexican archaeologists have excavated corn pollen, whose age is 55,000 years. But corn doesn't have a wild ancestor either. Moreover, this culture does not grow without human help. A ripe cob, not picked in time, just falls and rots. However, science says that primitive people appeared only 40,000 years ago. Who in America grew corn long before the appearance of intelligent man? And the genetic code of legumes was definitely artificially changed millions of years ago. This intermediate link is missing, and from the point of view of morphological differences and differences in the chromosome set, of course, there is a very big difference. There is no intermediate link between a monkey and a man. We, the people of the 21st century, have deciphered our genetic code. But in this code, we constantly come across relationships that we are not yet able to explain. The chariot of the gods flies better than fighters. In the Bible, there are many stories with some devices that noise Stardovala from the earth and return. There are technical instructions in ancient texts. It is said that this pillar of fire was lit in the sky by an angel, in fact a pilot. Modern scientists have also learned how to create genetically modified organisms. However, they have not yet managed to cross to complex species and get viable offspring. Nature has a secret that has not yet been revealed. Perhaps the key to it lies in nanotechnology, which should be used in genetic engineering. But could it be that thousands of years ago, someone knew about nanotechnology? One sensational archaeological find proves this. In the Urals, on the small river Narada, gold prospectors accidentally stumbled upon tens of thousands of tiny spiral-shaped artifacts. The largest of them are only 3 centimeters, the smallest are hundredths, like 3/100ths of a millimeter. They are better viewed under a microscope. It was found that these artifacts consist of rare metals tungsten and molybdenum. But the biggest surprise, and this was confirmed by an examination in one of the Moscow institutes, was the age of these objects. About 300,000 years. The question of who could make those amazing things in the time when our ancestors were running around the ground, all covered with hair. This is what these incredible spiral-shaped artifacts look like. They were found in 3 places in the northern Urals by geological expeditions. The depth of occurrence is up to 12 meters, which corresponds to deposits of 300,000 years ago. The ratio of the thickness of the core to the thickness of the spiral itself is in proportion to the golden ratio. To this day, no one can explain what it is and how it got into the ground. But technical analysis allows us to make an assumption. The very first version is that these are the parts of our satellites or rockets accidentally mixed from the ground. They have traces of dragging, that is, some kind of stripes. And we understand that from the point of view of technology, we are doing the same thing. And that is why, when the research of these artifacts began, the first thought was that maybe this could be the most understandable tungsten spiral that we use in a lamp. It turned out that it couldn't. The composition of tungsten of ancient artifacts is different than in incandescent lamps. Moreover, there are no characteristic traces of melting on the spirals. There is no doubt that these are parts of a technical device, but what kind? The place where it was found, it looks very much like some kind of parabolic antenna, which is made in the ground. A huge number of these spirals were found in the ground. And what is important, geologists found a large number of huge quartz lenses in the same place. And the first thought that arose from the experts, so it seems to be the elements of the antenna device. Ancient disguised antenna. But who and how 300,000 years ago built a device on the territory of Russia based on technologies that are advanced for us? According to the researchers' theory, this huge device had the property of what we call smart glass. These are touch screens of phones and tablets, car mirrors and windshields. In the latter, thread-like heating elements are used. As a rule, they are made of tungsten with the addition of other rare earth metals. but not like these ancient finds. I am convinced that when we have relations with technologies of this level, there, as in the pyramids, there is nothing, let's say, prophetic attitude to the implementation of any one idea. Everything is very diverse and all very complex. That is, of course, we can say something clever. In other words, this whole basin, which has the shape of a parabolic antenna, is a kind of device. That is absolutely related to the mind. There's something very, very clever there. But why did only microscopic fragments remain of the ancient device in the Urals? Michael Cremo is an expert on archaeological anomalies. He can offer an answer to this question. High-tech artifacts will not be able to survive in the layers of the earth for a long time. For example, computers. They will not last long, because metals rust very quickly, and plastic will decompose. Therefore, it may well be that millions of years ago, there were people who used computers and smartphones, but they have not survived. One strange feature was discovered in ancient nanospirals from the Urals. Some are melted on one side, and as if welded into thunder. But the melting point of tungsten, 3,500 degrees, there is no such point source of heat in nature. And this speaks unequivocally about the following. The impact was laser, high temperature, pulsed and very short. And then what happens? A certain object in this place was destroyed by a laser beam right in the ground, and it was a man-made device. And then what happens? Is this a war? Is it that someone was destroying something here? There is still evidence in favor of the fact that metallurgy was known at a high level in ancient times. In Delhi, in the courtyard of the Kut Minor Mosque, there is a metal column known as the Pillar of Pindar. Its height is 7.5 meters diameter, 48 centimeters. The inscription on the colony says that it was brought and put in memory of the victory over the peoples of Central Asia during the reign of Raja Sam Mandraganta in the 4th century. This, however, does not mean that it was done that way. There are many temples and sacred places in India that have a very long history, which are many millions of years old, according to traditional concepts. But, of course, in each particular case, not everything is scientifically proven. That is why I conducted my research to prove that there is archaeological evidence published in the scientific literature. The Indra pillar is in its original form and has not been rusting for at least 1,500 years. To answer the question why, scientists analyzed the composition of the metal, and it turned out incredibly. The iron content in the samples is 99.7%. This is almost impossible pure iron. Presumably, the column was made by casting, but if so, then the melting temperature of the metal should be above 1,500 degrees, and given the purity of iron, it would have to be melted in vacuum or in space. Needless to say, 1,500 years ago, such technologies did not exist. Iron, similar in chemical composition, was found in another place, and not on this planet, but in samples of lunar soil. How should this be regarded? Presumably, the column could have been made of meteoritic iron, but this does not explain why it does not corrode. Researchers are inclined to the absolutely fantastic hypothesis that if the Indra pillar is made of steel of an ancient spaceship, made of a special alloy, which is made in space and specially designed for high loads. But then, where did this device come from, and to whom did it belong? All over the world, there are artifacts of ancient cultures, similar to the image of airplanes, pilots, and even astronauts. How can this be explained? Someone has known about flying for a very long time. In different world cultures, there are many stories and legends about the chariots of the gods, about people who can move through the air. It can't just be a coincidence. Reading ancient texts from the standpoint of modern knowledge also gives reason to believe that aviation was already known to people before our era. Researchers consider the Bible to be a real storehouse of such stories. In the Bible, there are many stories with some devices that noise start ovala from the earth and return. Some flying objects, celestial chariots, something that we call flying saucers today, were described. The most diverse forms that people observed, but could not explain and deified them. A little-known apocryphal text, the life of Adam and Eve, not translated from the army into Latin. The Lord ordered the archangel Gabriel to send Adam on a fiery chariot to the paradise of justice, from where Adam soon requested to return to earth. The Lord, accompanied by the singing of angels, descended from the heavenly chariot, which was carried away by the cherubim. Eve saw a radiant chariot approaching, drawn by 4 shining eagles, followed by angels who illuminated the place where Adam is. The Bible also describes the case of the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel describes a vehicle that goes down. He describes not only this vehicle, but also the noise it makes, comparing it with the roar of an army, the noise of a waterfall. It must have been really loud. The vehicle stands in front of Ezekiel. Ezekiel describes wings, wheels, metal legs, and the like. Today, we have a wonderful reconstruction of this car. It was made at NASA. Who has seen the Atlantans? It was the Atlantans who were a highly developed civilization and gave them knowledge at that time before the flood happened. How did the ancient Vimanas fly? Such a technical filling is quite inherent in our modern views on constructive solutions. Austrian Professor Alguntenboom also tried to take an unbiased look at ancient sources. A number of amazing discoveries awaited him, even in the canonical text of Holy Scripture. Let us turn to the exodus of the children of Israel from Egypt. There was a very dramatic scene when the Pharaoh wanted to return his slaves and sent an army in pursuit of them. It was about 1400th year before the birth of Christ, and a pillar of cloud showed the way to the children of Israel. And so I ask the question, how can a cloud column adhere to some kind of course, which could be guided at night? And they had to walk at night in order to leave Egypt as soon as possible. A pillar of fire appeared. Then, as it is written in the Bible, an arrow fell from a pillar of fire from above and plunged into the ground, thus drawing an insurmountable border between the Israelites and the Egyptian army. The Bible says that this pillar of fire was lit in the sky by an angel, in fact a pilot. Apparently, it was a stream of hot air from some kind of machine that was able to silently plan. As for the thunder and lightning, it can be assumed that they were shells or something like that. And this caused such a panic in the ranks of the elite and well-armed Egyptian army that the soldiers simply rushed to flee and drowned in the sea. An aircraft before our era. Is it possible to interpret the archaic language of ancient texts so much in favor of high technology? But Professor Enbaum has something more serious than myths. There are amazing artifacts that the Indians left in the niches of tombs in pre-Columbian times. These are golden airplanes made of tumbaga, an alloy of copper, gold, and a fraction of silver. And these found golden planes have the most perfect aerodynamic properties. Al Gutenbo and aircraft modeler Peter Belting conducted a unique experiment. They made a scale model of a golden airplane, attached a motor to it, and launched it into the air. And he really flew. And we congratulated each other, drank a little, turned on the engine, and started it again. And he has risen to 1,000-meter height. I made sure that in the thin air it also flies perfectly. In order to have a little drink, the reason for the researchers was more than serious. It turned out that the aerodynamic characteristics of the Golden Bird met all the requirements of a modern aircraft. But the age of these birds is not less than 3,000 or 4,000 years. Here's what the researcher himself told us about it. Their shape corresponds to the shape of high-speed machines. Folded configuration of the bearing surface. Today, all high-speed aircraft have complex wings. All of them have low plans, a wing from the bottom of the fuselage, like all military jets that develop high speeds. They all have a wing from the bottom. So it's most likely an airplane that flew within and possibly beyond the atmosphere. But N-bomb and belting were waiting for an even more incredible discovery. A wooden model in the hands of a scientist is a copy of a find from the ancient Egyptian city of Saqqara. According to scientists, things are at least 5,000 years old. Archaeologists sincerely considered her a statuette of a hawk with wings spread. The hieroglyphs on the tail of the bird read, "An offering to the god Oman." But few people know that Oman is also the god of air jets, wind and flight. And the animals and birds in the land of the pyramids were commanded by a completely different deity. The most interesting thing about this bird is that it's not a bird. Not a single anatomical detail corresponds to the bird's anatomy. The wings of birds are where people's hands are on their shoulders. It's a monoplane with a high wing. Emboldened by the success of the golden chariot of the Indian chief in Boma, Belting made an enlarged copy of the wooden hawk and sent it into the sky. And she also flew beautifully. In this model, we find all the details of a modern aircraft. For example, the wing is connected to the fuselage, exactly by the sublight, as in gliders. The side steering wheel is surprisingly large. The ends of the wings are rounded deltoidically, and at the same time bent downwards. This detail made us break our heads. Why? The ends of the wings of modern aircraft are bent upwards. It has recently become clear that the advantage of this form is that it provides additional stability when flying straight and level. For a direct flight, this is very important. The glider could have been invented in ancient Egypt. But to run it, you need an airplane with an engine. And scientists doubt that the archaeological finds were reduced copies of real devices. It is very unlikely that people could have done this 1,500 years ago. They didn't have the technology to build such a device on their own. At that time, many things were not invented at all. And what we see is very complex systems. You need to have an idea about aerodynamics, about control systems. And people at that time carried stones on their backs or dragged them along the rails, and did not have any special knowledge. At least, we don't know about it, because there is little evidence from that era. Most likely, the ancient people simply observed these flying machines, which were controlled by someone else. Moreover, they did not take credit for their inventions. Everywhere it is said that these are the chariots of the gods. Let's ask ourselves the question, what is the prototype? At the same time, it should be understood that the age of the prototypes does not necessarily correspond to the age of the finds. They can be much older. But who was taken for gods and firm where planes flew to the First Nations in ancient times? A sensational find was recently made in Bulgaria. Mysterious remains were found during excavations in the Black Sea village of Durankulak. At first glance, the skulls found were no different from the others, but they had some strange markings on them. The examination showed that these are traces of trepanation of the skull, an operation that is still very difficult today. But scientists were even more shocked when they managed to establish the age of the finds. They are at least 10,000 years old. Who could do such operations in the era of the caveman? Krasimirev, associate professor of the Medical University of Sofia, he explored the strange findings. 10,000 years ago, trepanation was actually performed on the skull 10,000 years ago. And it is hard to imagine that in those days such operations as skull trepanation could be performed. It is interesting that the instruments that carried out these trepanations have been preserved. They were made by another civilization, or by someone from the local people trained by this other civilization. The ancient country of Thrace was partially located on this territory of Bulgaria. 2,000 years ago, it was experiencing its heyday. But was it so highly developed power? Experts find even more ancient artifacts that suggest that a completely different race lived here or visited these places. Since none of the known peoples existed at that time, scientists thought about the nations that are considered legendary. There is also such a hypothesis. The ancient Atlantans left their knowledge to the local population living on the Balkan Peninsula. This is definitely Montenegro and Thrace. And there is such a hypothesis that it was the Atlantans who were a highly developed civilization and passed on knowledge to them at that time before the flood happened. And is it so? Atlantans flew to the Balkans and taught ancient peoples to live. Was the Atlantan civilization really that advanced? There were nanotechnologies in ancient Egypt. Maybe it was a previous civilization of Earth. Why did the gods take people's gold?
It kills cancer cells in the human body.
At the beginning of the 20th century, books by the occultist writer James Chwerd were published in the United States. He claimed that in India, he communicated with a monk who kept the knowledge of previous civilizations. Churchward described about the homeland of mankind, the continent of Lemuria, which died in the Pacific Ocean. Atlantis allegedly became the heir of this highly developed race. Here's how the author talks about aircraft that flew 20,000 years ago. With a powerful reg of rapid descent from an unimaginable height, surrounded by bright fiery masses that filled the sky with dancing tongues of flame, the ship of the fiery lords rapidly swept through the airspace. He stopped over a white island lying in the Gobi Sea. Presumably, Atlantis had flying machines, high technology, electricity, metals, and machines that allowed them to create these aircraft. In India, as indicated in the Ramayana and other texts written in Sanskrit, these aircraft were called vimanas. In Atlantis, they are supposed to have been called inelixi. There were various types of these ships. Some of them were shaped like cigars. They were cylinders with windows on the sides, but they did not have wings. Others were shaped like a disc and looked like flying saucers. Other vimanas had wings, and they looked very much like modern airplanes. Later, in 1973 year, an English translation of the work on the vimanas of the Vimanika Shastra was published, which was written down from the words of the Indian Brahmin Sabara and Shastra. He claimed to have learned everything telepathically from the Bodhisattva. The book gives diagrams and the appearance of the devices. Viman is such a collective concept. As for us, such a collective concept is an aircraft. Helicopter, plane, airplane, military jet fighter, aircraft, too. Like a private jet and a jet plane, too. Given the source of the information, the book was not welcomed. According to the results of their research in 1974 year, the aviation engineers of the Indian Scientific Institute, Bangalore, came to the conclusion that these vimanas are the fruit of ignorant fabrications. It is described that when they started, there was such a strong wind that houses were shaking and trees were uprooted, and elephants ran away in panic. In the sky, they let out such a roar that it seemed that the sky would burst. It's very similar to a sonic boom. They must have been incredibly fast cars, and most likely they were not flown by locals. There may have been a few select pilots, but the gods flew them first. We asked Vladimir Melnikov, Doctor of Technical Sciences, academician of the Russian Academy of Cosmonautics, to comment on the scheme of the devices firm the Shastri Broom. He has been engaged in aircraft construction all his life and today teaches at the Moscow Aviation Institute. The main question that interested us was, can it fly? So, structurally, this is one of the blocks. Well, let's say that the propulsion system, which was supplied, obviously, was made up of several such blocks. As if there were usually 4 blocks, sometimes 3 or 4 for stability and had. It is obvious and yet structurally decided on jet propulsion for flight in our atmosphere. So, here are the elements considered, the elements of such a constructive solution, but they need to be translated and disassembled. That is, to put it bluntly, but such a technical filling is quite inherent in our modern views on a constructive solution. Oddly enough, in the drawings attributed to the prehistoric creators of the Vyman, the scientist found many familiar elements. According to Vladimir Melnikov, each model of the device could well have taken to the air. Moreover, she would have behaved as described in ancient texts. For flights at high speeds, these jet engines are used here, which are at the edges. It is to accelerate. Surely this is a high-speed construction. This is a multi-section chassis. It provides landing and takeoff during acceleration. For the reason that then there should be a configuration here, this whole one, it is a type of balloon. However, at the time of publication of the book, all this had already been invented. The question of who and when constructed these Vimanas remains open today. According to Vladimir Melnikov, the Vyman drawings are so primitive that they could have been invented by a modern student and recorded by an ancient aircraft technician. It is obvious that the book was written not by the designer but by the performer. I would like to point out that these designs are inspired by hand-drawn designs by people who have observed some constructive solutions of the gods. Could the ancient people call the Atlantans gods? Assuming this, many details of this historical puzzle converge. A number of ancient texts that mention previous civilizations directly indicate that the inhabitants of Atlantis were giants. The Adrents were smaller. They believe they were about the order of 5 meters. But if you remember, I said at the beginning that almost all of the skeletons that are found, they turn out to be in these gradations from 3 to 5, 3.5 meters to 5. Does not rise higher. This approximately turns out to be just the growth of Atlanta. In ancient sources, there is a mention that part of the Atlantans, after their continent went underwater, ended up on the territory of ancient Egypt. It was they who, being more advanced, created the great civilization of the ancient world. It was their local tribes that took them for gods. If we assume that the Atlantans really had a more impressive growth than the Aborigines, then everything falls into place. On temple frescoes, the gods are always depicted as taller than ordinary Egyptians. So the mystery of the Egyptian pharaohs can be explained without any alien hypothesis. Our legend said that these were the Atlantans, that the Atlantans were the teachers of the Egyptian lives. And Egypt is considered the birthplace of the tarot, well, at least, the birthplace of that information, that philosophy, which is now already known to us under the guise of the most talk cards. Who were the Atlantans themselves? Well, there are several options. Maybe it was a previous civilization of the Earth. Maybe it was some kind of aliens who somehow got to Earth with their tools, with their large amount of knowledge. The works of occultists say that knowledge was transmitted to people by Hermes Trismegistus, or the Egyptian god Thoth. A real historical person. According to sources, Hermes was the deified king of Egypt. He was revered as the patron saint of wisdom and sciences, writing, the creator of the calendar. Hermes Trismegistus, the famous Egyptian god, could be an Atlantan by the level of his knowledge, by the level of his abilities. Who was that Hermes Trismegistus really? How could one person possess a huge amount of scientific knowledge? Where did he get it from? Logically, only a large civilization that had reached a high level of development could accumulate such data. This race must have been much older than the Egyptian one. Hermes the thrice great is unclear who. On the one hand, he is mentioned as a deity who came to earth. On the other hand, the Egyptians speak of a whole sequence of very tall beings who came under the name of Hermes. Where did they come from? Hermes himself says that he does not, as it were, expound this wisdom, but transmits it to people, hinting that it existed before him. What kind of knowledge did that Hermes impart to the Egyptian priests? Traditionally, he is considered the founder of alchemy. By and large, this is the science of prolonging human life. Alchemy has never claimed to be a science. It was such a secret, universal, esoteric, as we would say now, secret knowledge. It was introduced into the occult societies. For example, the Rosicrucian Society. The Rosicrucians were engaged in science, and other secret orders that were also engaged in science, in particular, the Order of the Hospitallers, Templars, and so on. Then, a little later, in the 16th-17th century, it became medicinal alchemy. Medicines for alchemy, making all sorts of arcana, all kinds of panacea, and so on. And it was medicinal, that is, medical, that is, healing activity. It was claimed that the alchemists knew the secret of transmutation, transformation of some chemical elements into others. The meaning of their life was to create a philosopher's stone, a kind of reagent. It was necessary for the transformation of any metals into gold. But that wasn't the most important thing. It was believed that he was burning immortality. How is it all connected? Recently, historians have found out that the pharaohs and the nobility had an interesting habit of sleeping in gold masks and rubbing gold dust before going out to the people. Today, it is known that there is no more effective protection against harmful infrared radiation. I think the Egyptian sayers knew something that we don't know. It's natural. This means that past knowledge still needs to be discovered and discovered in order to include their modern body of knowledge. Moreover, it is possible that the rulers of the Nile even used gold for food. Biochemist Olga Listopad believes that white cones are in the hands of gods and pharaohs in frescoes. This is the royal bread, the so-called fine gold.
Why white bread? Because in order for gold to have a rejuvenating effect, it must be finely dispersed, very finely dispersed. Practically, it will be nanoparticles, probably, and fine gold has such a light reflection coefficient that it looks almost white.
However, did ancient Egypt already know how to produce nanogold? Ancient temples were centers of healing. The temple service was engaged in the treatment of mental illness. Then the first people appeared on earth. I find many descriptions of human bones, artifacts that date back millions of years. The Egyptian authorities ordered English chemists to analyze gold jewelry from the tomb of Pharaoh Tutankhamun. The test results shocked everyone. It turned out that this gold was so susceptible to purification that it is no longer possible to determine the place of its extraction. Moreover, the experts were waiting for a new surprise. Some of the artifacts contained 99% pure gold and only 1% impurities. This cannot be done with the technology of that time.
It is impossible to achieve such purity by any method of purification, especially the method that we find in papyri, using some bran there. Such purity can be achieved only by electrolysis and in no other way. This suggests that electrolysis was known and used in Egypt.
But why did the ancient Egyptians need chemically pure nanogold? Moreover, in such quantities. A number of historical facts suggest that they mined or synthesized this metal not for themselves. Moses has an indication in two places that the Israelites had to offer a high sacrifice to God when diamonds, gold, emeralds had to rise to a certain height. They had very complex alloys, zinc, gold, various mixtures. The gods must have taught them to do it. And they gave many, many tons of gold to the gods for this. Perhaps the gods wanted to live forever and knew how to achieve this with the help of gold. When scientists studied the effect of metals on the human body, an amazing thing turned out. First, the doctors installed one absolutely neutral element that does not interact with the tissues in any way. It turned out to be gold. It began to be used in prosthetics. Later, several more elements were found, but only gold turned out to be curative. And new discoveries have incredibly confirmed what ancient civilizations somehow knew about.
It kills cancer cells in the human body it restores. That is, why does a person age and get sick? There is a failure in the system. It also restores. She shoots these programs. It kills all pathogenic microflora in the body.
There is an opinion that all this ancient knowledge of the Egyptian priests has not disappeared for almost 2,500 years. They were carefully passed down from generation to generation in the Holy Land, and they could be adopted. This is what the founders of the secret societies of Europe took advantage of. The oldest of the famous military spiritual orders was formed in the 12th century. The Order of Saint John, aka later the Order of Malta. The Knights monks were called Ionites or Hospitallers. The documents state that they came to the Holy Land and created the first hospital, a hospital hotel for a pilgrim. However, the researchers think that the order is settled there is not it. But the fact is that the history of the Hospitallers, the history of the knowledge that the Hospitallers carried through 1,000 years, lies. It started much earlier. It is known that in the year 1730th year of BC, Egypt was captured by troops of the Semitic tribes, which then ruled almost 500 years. One of the Semitic princes is described even in the Bible. This is Moses. Historians claim that he was not a rootless foundling at all. On the contrary, it was Moses who was supposed to ascend the throne, but there was an uprising of the indigenous inhabitants of Egypt, and he considered it best not to fight for the crown, but to take his tribesmen back to Palestine. This episode is described in the Bible as the exodus of the Jews from Egypt. The temples were very specialized in the method of treatment. For example, the Temple of Thoth was engaged in the treatment of urolithiasis. The Temple of Osiris was engaged in the treatment of mental illnesses. The Temple of Isis was engaged in oncology. That is, each temple had its own medical specialization, which was taught from the age of 4 to 20 years, that is, 16 years of doctor training in Egypt. And all this knowledge was brought to new territories, to a new biological niche that we know today. There's Palestine, Israel, the most valuable thing that the descendants of the Hyksos took out of the greatest heritage of ancient Egypt. This is knowledge about the structure of the human body and the universe. The medical techniques and methods of the pyramid country were the most advanced for that region. The night monks, called Hospitallers or Pianists, were credited with miracles. It was said that they commanded demons and knew the secret of eternal life. In fact, they may have only studied the biotechnologies of ancient Egypt. They began to think much like the same magicians and healers of ancient civilizations. Therefore, the change in their psyche has also left a significant imprint on the techniques they used during their medical experiments. Medical work. They created a system of psychological influence on the enemy, which was based on those very ancient Egyptian realities, on those ancient Egyptian mysteries. When God was invoked, when they saw the very living God that the Egyptian priests spoke about. Researchers believe that much of that knowledge and skills were lost in the Middle Ages. The Catholic Church played an important role in this. However, over the centuries, the Order of the Ionites, or the Order of Malta, has become one of the most influential political structures in the world. Today, the order positions itself as a state without a territory, has a DIP, relations with 104 countries, and observer status of the Prion. What ancient knowledge gives him power? Ancient supercivilization technology. But how long ago did it appear on the planet? Modern textbooks describe only discoveries that support the dominant theory of evolution. She says that people like us first appeared less than 150,000 years ago, having evolved from ape-like ancestors. But in the originals of scientific reports in different languages, I find many descriptions of human bones, artifacts that date back millions of years. This is very surprising. In 1860, and second year of scientific journal Geologist came out with a sensational description of the archaeological finds in the area McCubbin, Illinois, USA. Human bones were found in a coal seam at a depth of about 30 meters, and the age of this coal is 300 million years. It was not the skeleton of a humanoid ape or a primitive hominid, but of a creature identical to the modern Homo sapiens. And he wielded not stone hoes, but high technology. This is indicated by another intriguing find in the same area. In 1800, there was a woman in Illinois, Miss Kobe, who wanted to put a piece of coal in the stove. The piece was very large, so she broke it in half, and suddenly found a gold chain 8 inches long inside. This coal is about 300 million years old. Magic? This is an unknown technology. He looks absolutely like an astronaut. Archaeologists say it's supposedly a shaman, where the gods of ancient civilizations have gone. And one day the genetic experiments ended. It turns out that more than 100 remains of modern humans who lived millions of years ago have been found on the planet. Errors are excluded. The bones are dated using the most advanced methods. But how is this possible? Does all this mean that our civilization is not the first on Earth? Academician Hartwig Hausdorff believes that perhaps it is not even the most developed. In the early 70s, a French company mined uranium, or in the African state of Gabon. Unexpectedly, it turned out that the content of fissionable uranium-235 in the samples was significantly lower than expected. Then they began to investigate whether this uranium had already been used by someone. And it turned out that the uranium deposit in Oklo in Gabon has such outlines, which, taking into account the half-life of uranium, allow us to conclude, almost 2 billion years ago, or rather 1,750,000,000 years ago, there were 14 nuclear reactors here. All this has been calculated by physicists with great accuracy. But the question arises, who could have created a nuclear reactor so many years ago? Oddly enough, the answer to this question can again be found in ancient texts. In Sumerian mythology, there are several stories about traveling goddess Inanni of Mesopotamia in Africa. The route is also approximately indicated. This is how this place called Abzu is described. Far across the sea, 100 meters of water from this place, there is the land of Aaron. This is a place where blue stones cause illness, and where Master Ranu carries a silver axe that shines all day. In the place of Abzu, according to the ancient text, the chief of the gods, Enk, lived. He looked after the works, and kept items called me. What it is unclear. However, it was these items that made it possible to build cities and store information. Behind them, the goddess and Nano flew to the heavenly Odi, lured their Hyenki, and disappeared, shooting back from the guards. But what are the blue stones that cause the disease? The only analogy that researchers have is radioactive ore. Did the ancient peoples know nuclear power? Strangely enough, this hypothesis is indirectly confirmed by the discovery of the Soviet scientist Ivan Stepanovich Filimonenko. His scientific activity has been connected with the space and defense industries for many years. So, trying to create a nuclear-fueled engine, the scientist unexpectedly came to the conclusion that if the content of some radioactive elements in a living cell is changed, it can live much longer. But the ancient myths also testify to the same thing. And Filimonenko is here, under the wing of Korolev, Mishina, and so on. There's a whole galaxy of them there, these outstanding space designers of ours. They simply set before him, before the young scientist, the task was set to make it to us an autonomous electric power generator. And he did. They were installed on Topaz and successfully flew off on time. Filimonenko proposed a new way of obtaining energy through the reaction of cold nuclear fusion. He was one of the few who actively opposed the use of radioactive uranium in the USSR. The data obtained during the research shocked the scientist. He discovered that a person's life expectancy directly depends on a radioactive element called the isotope potassium-40. Disintegrating, it destroys living cells. If the human body contains 245 grams of the isotope potassium-40, then on average a person will live 61 years and 7 months. But if the level of radioactive elements is reduced, for example, to 7 grams, life will increase to 2,500 years. Archaeologists know cuneiform tablets, which indicate the names and periods of the reign of 8 kings. The first of them, Enman Luana, was in power for 43,200 years. The latter, Bartutu, 18,000 years. How is this possible? But the answer was found in the 20th century. Artifacts found on the territory of the ancient Sumerian state showed that the content of the isotope potassium-40 was then 175 times less than it is now. This means that the ancient Sumerians could really live for an average of 14,000 years. Historians, in a big sense of the word, they know this fact amazingly about the fact that indeed it is all described in the Sumerian tablets and in age. And the fact that Filimonenko is really Ivan Stepanovich once again emphasizes to us that it should be linked precisely with the scanty content of this isotopic. Isotopes, aggressive isotopes in the human body itself. Yes, this is a very serious application for the search for truth. According to physicists, there are 2 ways to reduce the level of radiation in the territory of residence of a large number of people. Create a protective shell to completely isolate the metropolis from radiation, or to make some cleaning plants, which Filimonenko worked on. He never managed to finish his idea. But how did the Sumerians succeed in this matter? They wrote that the gods gave everything. But were the Atlantans really gods? Then why did their civilization, which possessed such technologies, allow itself to disappear just like that? Erich von Däniken is convinced that we are talking about something else. The word God is wrong. There are no gods. Thousands of years ago were aliens from outer space. Our ancestors lived in the Stone Age, they didn't understand anything. And our ancestors mistakenly decided that the aliens were gods. But there are no gods. We know that. They were just called that. The ancient Sumerians called them Nephilim and Anunnaki and also considered them aliens from heaven. According to a number of experts, a number of visual facts indicate the origin of the gods. But 100 years ago, scientists would not have been able to interpret them. There are scandalous figurines and images all over the planet that do not fit into the generally accepted history. There are a large number of objects that can be interpreted from the point of view of ancient astronautics. One example that I admire the most. In Mexico, archaeologists have found an Olmeca 17-centimeter figure, and on it a classic helmet, a suit. He looks like an astronaut. Archaeologists say it's supposedly a shaman. In northern Italy, in the Valcamonica mountain valley, there are rock carvings of the Stone Age. It depicts strange creatures in protective suits. There is something similar in the mountains of the Sahara Desert and in South America, the town of El Bal. Locals believe that they painted gods. These divine beings are depicted as we imagine a man in a space suit with a helmet in a massive suit. Figures made in the Stone Age in Valcamonica seem to float. If someone were to show such a picture today, he would say that it was an astronaut. But if we know that this drawing is 5 to 10,000 years old, then it does not fit into our idea of the development of mankind. According to our ideas, there could not have been astronauts at that time. There are also figurines, for example, ritual dolls of Hopi-Kachin Indians or Dagu figurines in the East Asian Zmo culture. Dagu statues from Japan, the most famous of them, about this size. They date back to the period of Zmo, that is about 6,000 years before Christ. These figures have easily recognizable details of a space suit, ID-est helmets, fasteners, and so on. In the 60s, pictures of these figures and the results of examinations were sent to NASA, and based on these images, NASA created its own spacesuit for astronauts. Teachers from Atlantis hardly needed protective suits. This equipment is used in space travel. I have been studying this subject for many years and believes that these artifacts has brought aliens from other planets. Various legends and myths of the peoples of the world also testify in favor of the conclusion about extraterrestrials. They all say that the gods came from the stars. But what were they doing on Earth? According to von Däniken, the ancient aliens were engaged in genetic experiments here as part of an ethnological expedition. A being who travels from star to star knows many planets, not only the Earth and its like. There are planets where gravity is greater or less. There are planets hotter or colder. The aliens saw crocodiles in the Nile, little susceptible to heat. And then they see the lion. The lion kills the gazelle with the strength of his muscles. And why not intervene? The resistance to heat of one animal is crossed with the strength of another. This is how mixed beings were created. And one day the genetic experiments ended and the aliens left. They moved on. They didn't have to take these creatures with them, take them on board. Some DNA, only a few grams, and that's enough. The goal is to populate other planets with different conditions. The Swiss researcher is convinced that the exploration of other planets, a natural process for a highly developed civilization. If a species of intelligent beings appears somewhere in the universe, they will certainly want to know whether they are alone or not. And later, perhaps millions of years later, spaceships arrive that know for sure that this planet is similar to Earth. Not too hot, not too cold. This is not Jupiter. There is no methane here. You can survive here. Why did they come? For research and colonization of the planet with its own species. We don't know where they went. In the traditions of all earthly peoples, there is an indication that they promised to return. It is these legends that have been forcing researchers to peer into the starry sky for many years in anticipation of a new contact. And some even believe that alien ships have been plowing the expanses of the Earth's sky for a long time. Evidence of unidentified flying objects, the statistics of which are quite extensive. Science has given an explanation for these facts for a long time. UFOs are a natural phenomenon of unknown origin. However, what the sailors and pilots talk about is sometimes difficult to explain by simple atmospheric anomalies. Major General Nikolai Chaga is a legend of Russian aviation, an experienced sniper pilot, former commander of the famous Lipetsk Aviation Center. Over the years of service, he has seen a lot, but he still cannot find an explanation for one case. My merit? Well, you can call it in quotation marks, because it's immodest to say without quotation marks. Is that in the combat aviation of the Soviet Union, and then the Russian one in speed. It was the 90s. I was one of the first to broadcast that I see an unidentified flying object. He made a training flight on fighter bombers. The task was to drop a training bomb at a given point and return. Having gained altitude, Chiagu saw a huge object in the sky, as if it consisted of bright stars. The pilot hesitated. The bastard to do. Is this a violation of airspace? Then why can't Earth radars see it? Later it turns out that this UFO was observed by 5 more pilots of the Lipetsk Aviation Center who were in the air. But no one dared to report. It was clear to everyone. This is clearly a ship, but not of terrestrial nature. This threatened disciplinary punishment for violating the rules of radio exchange with the writing of a rally work, dismissal from the army. This was the way they used to treat the Soviet Union. Then it was still the Soviet Union. So they always treated the not very convenient truth. Oshaga, using the status of the deputy commander of the aviation center at that time, requested permission from the Earth to approach the object. The object changed its configuration greatly as I moved in relation to it. And I realized that he was not far away. And I realized that this was not a rocket launched from the Plesetsk Cosmodrome, and not yet some artificial space body, located outside the atmosphere. I realized that it was somewhere nearby. That's why I suggested to the flight director to fly around this object. Let me fly around it to determine its size and removal and location. The flight director was very afraid of the responsibility and not that. Where UFOs come from. It hung over Lipetsk and emitted red rays through. With an interval of several seconds, has contact with the aliens already taken place? But it wasn't that UFO. Here are copies of photos taken by the aircraft sighting complexes of Lipetsk fighters, including Nikolai Chaga's car. It was difficult to determine the size of the object, but it was at least several tens of meters. It hung over Lipetsk and emitted red rays at intervals of several seconds, 5 pulses of red color, lasting 1 to 2 seconds each pulse. Here, just something unreasonable flew and exuded such right signals it could not. So it was thinking. But the biorobot, he's already thinking in general. Historical analysis shows that people have always seen UFOs. Only at first the gods came out of them. Then these vehicles did not land anymore. But this UFO is very similar to the one described in the ancient texts of the chariot in Baku. If there are hints of jet engines in the danger, then the ghost ships in our sky are much more perfect. In the last decade, the most prominent aircraft designers have repeatedly wondered if UFOs are flying machines. how they do their unthinkable somersaults. Observations show that glowing balls and disks despise all the laws of terrestrial physics. They instantly gain crazy speed, abruptly change their trajectory, without any visible resistance. According to experts, the shape of the device plays an important role here. Several advantages. The first and most important thing is the lowest hydrodynamic resistance. If we take as a basis the theory of Bernoulli, that is, the equation of Bernoulli and flowability, the theory of flowability, then disc-shaped apparatuses have twice as much power is needed in order to move it. Twice as much power is needed. Accordingly, they have a quick recovery, that is, vertical takeoff, vertical landing, layout. Frankly speaking, no aircraft can be formulated for a 2 or 3 medium stay. Two medium, we mean water air, 3 medium water air, space. Developed powers have repeatedly tried to create disc-shaped aircraft. As a rule, these developments was classified, only occasionally information in print. For example, half a century ago, specialized magazines published a picture of an American flying saucer. But it was not the UFO with unknown sources of energy. Here we were talking about the so-called count effect. It occurs when the jet engine is operating under the dome, and the pressure causes the object to rise under the influence of circulating currents in the low-pressure zone. We know for sure that the Americans and Canadians were engaged in round flying objects, but nothing came of it. But maybe it was just for the sake of disguise, to show that it doesn't work. In fact, they did others as well. But most of all, the designers' minds are occupied with the problem of energy sources for UFOs. Judging by the maneuvers, they should have heavy-duty engines. What can be used as fuel? Hardly jet fuel. However, an absolutely paradoxical theory has been gaining popularity recently. Or maybe flying saucers don't have an engine at all. This idea was suggested by the so-called Biefeld-Brown effect. It all functions as follows. First, you should build a small experimental model. It consists of a triangle, a vertical triangle, the edges of which are made of aluminum. At the tip of the corners lies the thinnest wire. If you put a high voltage of 380 volts on a wire, ionization of air atoms occurs, and all objects, no matter what size, soar. The only problem is that a powerful voltage is needed. Scientists are arguing about this phenomenon. Some talk about the emergence of the phenomenon of anti-gravity or ion wind. The flow of ions rushes from the wire under tension down to the aluminum, and there is a lifting force. And if we develop this technology, we can come to portable energy carriers, and we will be able to lift objects of any shape and mass into the air, pyramids, balls, and triangles, while completely silently, up to the highest layers of the atmosphere. This idea was developed by Valentin Fomenko, a physicist who worked all his life at a defense rocket engineering company. He has been researching the UFO phenomenon for many years. The scientist came to the conclusion that these devices fly on clay strings. A gluon is an elementary microparticle in quantum physics, and the gluon strings are the natural electromagnetic currents of the Earth, a grid covering its surface. Oversaturation, the so-called energy flows, is being built in the nodes. This transformation, obviously, is still our electromagnetic one. Like our electromagnetic cocoon, so we believe. And there is a concentration in these nodes. It seems that we still do not fully understand the structure of space. In physics, a mysterious phenomenon is known that is characteristic of all high-precision measuring devices. Zero drift. With ultrafine metrological measurements, the same strange errors are repeated with constant constancy. According to scientists, the reason for this is the surrounding space, which continuously changes some parameters, and this affects the arrow of the device. What exactly is changing is still not exactly clear. Scientists suggest that constant energy flows based on gluons or other particles can permeate the entire universe. If this is confirmed, the problem of long space flights disappears. It will be possible to fly at any distance without fear of running out of fuel. It is even possible that energy flows may permeate other dimensions. At least today, this is the most convincing and well-founded theory of the principle of operation of the flying saucers of the future. So, official science says, modern man, that is, you and I, are the crown of creation and at the same time, the product of a long evolution. Maybe. Perhaps that's exactly what it is, but you must admit that too many facts do not fit into this familiar theory. So, until exhaustive answers are found to all these questions, we have the right to believe that many of our ideas about the world around us are nothing more than the territory of delusions. I wish you cosmic happiness, universal luck, and eternal love.